Privyet, everybody. So it turns out that this whole story in Poland really is just a circus with everybody but Ukraine saying that the missile came from Ukraine. The United States government has said that it came from Ukraine. The President of the United States stated that the missile did not come from Russia. Several U.S. officials have come out and stated that the missile came from Ukraine. The head of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, stated that the missile came from Ukraine. And even the Polish government, which is extremely antagonistic towards Russia, has concluded that the missile came from Ukraine. Which means that Ukraine has struck NATO territory. But it was an accident, you say. Well, the Biden administration made it very clear that the United States will defend every inch of NATO and will respond to any strike on NATO territory, even if it's accidental. So, Ukraine struck NATO territory. Accidentally? Shouldn't matter. I propose that the United States trigger Article 5 and declare war on Ukraine. I think that the United States should join forces with Russia just as it did during the Second World War, and together make war on Ukraine for attacking, well, not attacking, I shouldn't say that because they say it's accidental, for striking NATO territory. It's NATO territory. Russia has not attacked NATO territory. But Ukraine has. Accidentally, of course, right? Ukraine has accidentally struck NATO territory, right? Russia has not accidentally struck NATO territory, but Ukraine has. So if Russia accidentally struck Poland, would we be making excuses for Russia? We wouldn't be. But because it's Ukraine, we're making excuses. Well, it was an accident. Now, all jests aside, there are some observations that I've made that I would like to discuss in this video. For one, everybody except for Ukraine is saying that it was Ukraine that fired the missile that hit Poland and killed 2 people. Zelensky is still insisting that he did not, or that his country did not fire this missile. But Jens Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, is saying that Ukraine fired it. Poland is saying it. The United States is saying it. So what this tells me is that Zelensky is lying and that Ukraine is being dishonest. Now, if we are to believe the polls and NATO itself, the missile came from Ukraine. But Zelensky is saying that this isn't true. So Ukraine is lying, and they're trying to drag on this story in order to get NATO to react stronger against Russia. That's what's happening. This is a propaganda scheme, and the Ukrainians are saying, well, yeah, the missile hit Poland, but it was Russia that did it, so you guys really need to treat this as an attack on NATO. And the Ukrainians are trying to provoke further escalation. So what this tells me is that Zelensky and the Ukrainian government that NATO loves so much and that Poland loves so much doesn't mind using the death of Poles to make propaganda. And I'll go further than that. Ukraine doesn't mind killing Poles to make propaganda because Ukraine fired this missile. Whether it was accidental or whether it was done on purpose, well, it still leads us to the same conclusion, that Ukraine will use the death of Poles for propaganda. If Ukraine did it on purpose, then Ukraine doesn't mind murdering Poles to make propaganda. Of course it doesn't mind, because look at who their historical heroes are, people who murdered Poles. I mean, look at their historical heroes: Bandera, Melnik, Shuchevich, all of these monsters, these mass murderers, people who murdered Poles. Who are their historical figures? Who are their historical heroes? People who murdered Poles. So it doesn't really surprise me that they don't really give a damn about the death of Poles. So if Ukraine did it on purpose to provoke NATO, to intensify escalation, then that means that Ukraine doesn't mind murdering Poles to make propaganda. Now, if Ukraine did it by accident, that means that they don't mind using the death of Poles to make propaganda, and they see the Poles as basically propaganda fodder. Because they're not even being honest enough. They don't even have enough accountability. They don't have a sense of accountability to come out and say, yeah, it was an accident. They're not even saying that. They're still blaming it on Russia. They're still insisting that it was Russia, which means that they don't have accountability, and which means that they're dishonest. And it also means that they don't mind using the death of Poles to make propaganda for their own ends, for their own interests. So why the hell are Polish people allying themselves with a country that not only reveres historical figures who murdered their grandparents and great-grandparents, but doesn't mind today using the death of their people to make propaganda schemes? That's really what this is. Now, there is another observation that I want to make, and I thought about this earlier today. What if it was a Russian missile, which I don't believe so, but let's just say, hypothetically speaking, it was a Russian missile, and Ukraine is right, and NATO is lying. The Americans are lying, the Poles are lying, all these U.S. officials are lying. What if that is the case? Well, if that's the case, what that would tell me is that America is terrified of Russia. Now, if it's true that it was a Ukrainian missile, that tells me that America is not really willing right now to lie to cause a direct conflict between NATO and Russia, right? Because let's say that it was Ukraine and it was an accident, but that America really, really wants to cause a conflict between NATO and Russia. Then America would lie and say, no, it was a Russian missile and Ukraine is innocent. Now, let's say that Zelensky is telling the truth and it was a Russian missile, which it wasn't. Well, what that would tell me is that America and NATO in general is terrified of Russia, to the point that even if Russia actually hit NATO, then they still would just say that it was somebody else who launched it, and they really wouldn't want to push it any further. At the end of the day, the reality is that this missile came from Ukraine, and Ukraine struck NATO territory. So NATO really should respond to this and join forces with Russia and support Russia in its conflict against a country that actually struck NATO territory. Because let's remember that it wasn't Russia that struck NATO territory. It was Ukraine. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.